Hello everyone, my name is Fernando Teixeira and I'm a Senior Technical Instructor at AWS, currently teaching at the AWS Cloud Institute. Let's take a look at some practical DynamoDB development on a real serverless cloud application. Now today I have myself jumping off a cliff over here on a hang glider. Well, and that's maybe a good segue for us to just jump into this topic. So there's going to be some prerequisites in here, but don't worry, I got you covered. So you're going to need an AWS account, you're going to need some programming credentials because we're going to be hands-on, and yeah, to be hands-on we're also going to need the AWS SDK for Python. But the good news is I actually have a video that covers that, and I'm going to give you the link for that below. We're also going to need some basic understanding of DynamoDB, but guess what? I also have a video for that, and I'll put the link for that below as well. In this series of videos, I'm building a simple trip planning serverless application. So you'll be seeing me using different AWS service in the construction of this application. This application is a very simple travel planning application I wrote in React. Yeah, no, I'm not teaching React, so I'm not looking for style points here. I just want to show the cloud aspect of it. So I can list all of my current trips. I can list my past trips. For the current trips, I can click on one of them and view the details. In addition to the basic trip information, I can also have a detailed itinerary over here. Now, all of this data that you're seeing over here, yeah, that's coming out of DynamoDB. So we're going to take a look at how do we get that data from DynamoDB, how do we insert, how do we query. That's where we're going next. So we're going to be looking hands-on at a number of different operations like retrieving data, writing data. I'm not going to show you everything, so I'm not going to bother showing you deleting data. And there's some additional batch operations and other operations you can perform. Yeah, for all those details, I'm going to give you some links to some great DynamoDB documentation. And anything that I show you, I will share the code with you on the GitHub location that I'm putting on my description below. So let's get going. Before we can start operating on a DynamoDB table, we need to know what data we're going to put in there, right? So this is the standard JSON structure for my trip information. I have my partition key is going to be a user ID. A trip ID is going to be the sort key, and that's going to be a manufacturer key. I'm going to combine the start date of the trip with the first location of the trip. That's going to give me something unique. And yes, the other pieces of data are the start date, the end date, start time, and a list of locations of my trip. You also see that as the application gets used, I'll have the ability to create an itinerary for that trip, and then that gets added to the trip. And the itinerary is going to be a list of different events and activities at certain dates, times, locations, and so on. So now that we know what our data is, let's go into DynamoDB to actually create the table for that. Now over here in the DynamoDB dashboard, I'm going to create my table. The name of my table is going to be Travel Planner Trips. The partition key is going to be the user ID. And that's going to be essentially the user login on the application. And the sort key is going to be that manufactured trip ID. I'm not going to get you into any of the other DynamoDB settings because, the focus here is more the development side of it. I'm going to create my table. Yeah, and in DynamoDB, it's not like relational. This table is going to be available pretty much the moment I refresh here, I should see that table ready. And there it is. There's a table created, ready to be used. So now let's write some code to get to that table. We're going to start here by doing a put operation to start inserting data into our database. What you're seeing over here is a Jupyter Notebook. If you haven't seen a Jupyter Notebook, it's just a very nice combination of code that I can execute and some cells that actually have text. I'll tell you, even the text, that's just a Python comment over here. It's just that it gets formatted nicely. I'll include some links to Jupyter Notebooks. And for those who want, I'm also going to include all of the plain Python code for this. All right, so the big 1, 2, 3 numbers you see over here is that anytime I teach developing in AWS, I like to say there are 3 key steps on any kind of an AWS SDK operation. That's step 1, you have to get yourself the SDK. In Python, that's import boto3. If this was C#, it would be using. If this was Java, it was going to be import as well. So every language is going to have a way of importing the SDK, and that's always going to be step 1. Step 2, you need to create a client to interact with that service. Depending on the service, you're going to have one or more or even more clients available. For DynamoDB, I can use the service client or the resource client. I'm going to show you both in this notebook, so I won't bother explaining too much about the difference now, and you're going to understand what they are. So in this statement, I'm going to create a resource client. That's the first one that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to specify the region that I want to use over here, US East 1. That's where I created my table. But after that, honestly, I can just use the default. But for the first example, I figured I would include the region specification. Well, so now I have this DDB client that I can operate with. So the third step is, yes, I use the client to perform my operations on that service. If I'm using the resource client for DynamoDB, really I primarily do this one step with the client, which is to get a resource to that table. So the table created was travel plan or trips. So this call over here is gonna get a object pointing to that table. It's very object oriented in nature. So after I make this call, this trips table object, yeah, that's holding that table in its hands and I can perform operations on it. To do a put, I'm going to need my primary key, my partition key plus my sort key. So I'm going to define my data over here. Yes, it's going to have for sure my partition key and my sort key, but it's going to have some of that other data that I talked about. So if I do if I run over here now, that variable trip data has my data. So now I have my reference to the table. I have my data. I can go ahead and do a very simple put operation. So I'm going to do on that resource, not the resource client, but the table resource that I got out of the resource client over here, the trips table. Yeah, I'm going to use that to do a put item call. And I just pass the trip data over here. Boom, there's my data. I can check the response over here, but the response honestly for a put, it's just going to be some basic, metadata in there because I'm not getting anything back. Now, the best way you can see, did this thing actually work? You can go over here back to the console. Take a look at the table. If I click on the table, I kind of quickly over here do an explore table items and run. There you go. There you can see my user ID Lexi, the trip to Vermont, the end date, the start date. Yeah, so the data is in there. Now let me show you how to use a service client. Service client, folks, it's going to look a little more complicated. Service client you tend to use for when you need to do something more complex like transactions. I will tell you most of my other examples. I'm going to stick to the resource client because it's a little more intuitive on the JSON. But just to show you one time, over here, I'm going to do a call. Basically, I'm reassigning this client to be a service client. So that's going to be the Bodle3 client, DynamoDB. Again, for the first example, I'm using the region specification here. It would use a default if I didn't. Again, I still am going to need my partition key and my sort key, but where you're going to see the big difference is when I'm actually defining the JSON. Whoa, that looks a lot bigger, right? Yeah, when you're using the service client, the low-level client, you use a specific DynamoDB JSON representation that includes a little data type designation for everything. So this one over here is a string, this one over here is a list because I could have multiple locations. And within that list, then I have a string item over here. So yeah, it's a lot more verbose. Now it's gonna work the same way. In this case, I'm creating a trip to Portugal over here. I define the item, and once again, the call is not gonna be all that different. I'm gonna use the client to do a put item. In this case, because I didn't grab that table ahead of time, I do specify, hey, the table that I'm gonna be using in travel planner trips, and then I pass the trip data over here. I can check the response down here the same way I did before. And again, the response for a put is not going to be anything particularly interesting. And if I want to see that I got that trip to Portugal inserted, let's go back over here. Let's run this query again. And there you go. There is Moose's trip to Portugal. All right, so let's take a look at how to retrieve data from the database. There are multiple ways to retrieve data in DynamoDB. I'm going to start with the simplest one, the get item, which is going to give me a specific item based on the primary key. The SDK stuff is going to be the same. I'm going to follow the same Fernando rules. I'm going to start step 1, get the SDK and any other libraries I might want. Then the step 2 is going to be to get my client object. Once again, I'm going to show you both client objects here, the service client and the resource client. I'm going to start with the resource client. So this call is going to give me the resource client over here. Notice this signature over here, Bodle3 resource. Now that I have the resource client, I'm going to use that resource client to get a reference to that travel planner trips. That's step 3. So I can do all of my calls now with that object. I will tell you, I've already added some additional data to the database just so I can have more interesting gets. When I'm doing a get, I need to get a specific item, so I need to provide my full primary key. Now, in my case, that's a partition key with a sort key because that's what I defined as. But in some cases, you will see that I may not need a sort key. The partition key is enough to fully identify an item. It just depends on your database design. I specify here the data that I want to retrieve. In this case, my user ID is going to be Tucker, and my trip ID is going to be a trip to Iceland for Tucker. So let me specify the key criteria. And when you get to the get operation here, you're going to see I use this key parameter to specify that primary key. So it's a get item with the key parameter. This is going to change in different types of queries. As we make the call over here, well, theoretically that retrieved the data, right? How do we know? Well, we can have to take a look at that response. So we look at that response. First, I'm going to print the whole thing. It's a JSON response, so I use a JSON library to make it look a little nicer, so you can visualize that full JSON structure. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here. And I know I added other things to this data that you haven't seen yet. We'll do that later, like adding an itinerary. But that primary stuff we looked at is right here, the user ID and date, start date, and trip. But where is that located in the JSON? Well, I have to kind of take a look at my structure. And I can see that my data, locations over here on top, is under this item attribute. And now that I understand the format of the full JSON structure, yeah, then I can use regular manipulation of JSON in Python to get to the specific data that I need. So over here, yeah, I can get that full item structure by using, a regular Python dictionary and get my item. And then out of that item, I get specifically just the location, the start date, and the end date. So if I run this, there you go. That's the data, just the data that I wanted. And folks, if you're thinking, hold on, I'm not going to be using this Jupyter Notebook inside my application. No, you're going to be using the Python code. I'm just showing you the Python code inside Jupyter Notebook because then I can put all those lovely comments over here that I do. But if you want a sneak peek, we're not going to be doing the coding part today yet. But you can take a look. If you look at this call over here, get item, trip statable, get item, and key. Yeah, this is a Lambda function that I'm going to eventually show you. And you can see the same call is in there. Trip statable, get item. So anything we're doing here, yeah, that becomes a Python code that goes into our Lambda function or whatever we're using to do our actual coding inside of a full application. Right, one more thing I want to show you. I will show you how to do the service client get items. So let's scroll down a bit over here. So I'm going to start by retrieving the service client. And in this case, if you look at the signature, a little different. The other one had resource on it, but it's going to be a DynamoDB client. With that client, I'm still going to need to specify the partition key, the sort key, and some kind of a specific criteria. So we're doing the same trip over here. So we have oranges with oranges. The call looks similar. You can see also the key over here. But notice we start getting that S over here, S over here. Well, that's because when you're doing the service client, you're dealing with that lower level DynamoDB JSON structure we saw in the put. So it's going to work. Grand, didn't give me an error, so it worked. But if I print the full response right now, let's take a look. Whoa, now that's a whopper of a response. It has a lot more stuff in there because it has all of those special little, yeah, it's hard to even scroll up. I won't even try. I'm just going to go straight to where I know the structure of this data now. So I'm going to go straight down here and, drill down on JSON to get what I want. But I will tell you, it's a little harder because now I have those special data type identifiers to get the stuff. Yeah. So it makes it a little harder. In the end, I can still do the same thing. There you go. There is my trip. But if you're operating with a lower level call, yeah, you're going to have to do a little more massaging with the JSON. As I said before, it is good for advanced operations, but from now on, I'm going to be sticking with just a resource client for anything else that I show. The next one we're going to look at is a DynamoDB query. Remember, when we did the get had to return just one specific item. Well, with the query, I can return multiple items matching a partition key, because remember, the partition key won't always be unique to one item. So I can use the partition key and an optional sort key to do some more flexible selection. But the partition key is going to have to be an exact match. The rest, yes, I'm going to go quicker now with my 1, 2, 3. I'm going to get my SDK. Then I'm going to get my client. And as I said, from now on, I'm going to keep using the resource client. And with the resource client, once again, same piece of code, I'm going to get that trip stable reference to my resource client. So now to get to the call, in this particular example for my trip application, let's say that I want to look at all the trips for a certain user. So it's not just one trip for the users, all the trips for that user. Well, my partition key and my sort key are the same ones, but in this case, I want to use just the partition key, the user ID, and I'm gonna put that in what's called a key condition expression. Remember, in the get, it was a key. When I'm doing a query, and that's the operation here, query is a key condition expression, different call. And in this case, the key condition expression is not gonna give me necessarily just one. In fact, I will have multiple trips for this user because I've pumped up the database with some additional data. So that's the format I'm gonna use here. So I'm gonna be looking for that user ID, having this user ID field, having this user ID that I'm specifying over here for my dog, Tucker. So over here, I set the variable that I'm going to be searching for. Over here, I make the call. And just like I did before, getting to the response, that's not going to change. The response is going to come back on that DB response object there. I'm going to show the JSON. Because I have more than one attribute, yeah, I'm going to get a lot of data over here. But you can see the format changes a little bit. Because I have more than one thing coming back on the query, I don't have just a single item. I'm going to have items. It's going to be a list of items. And once I understand the format of the output, then yes, then if I can just get to the stuff that I want in this next block. Right now I understand this is not a single one, it's going to be a list. So I'm just going to use a standard iteration in Python to get each item one at a time and then retrieve the things that I want. So when I run this, yes, I get a nice, so those are the 4 trips that Tucker has scheduled right now. So the query is great and it's going to get exceptional performance because it's using the partition key. So DynamoDB is going to optimize the heck out of that. But the obvious limitation is, well, sometimes I may want to query on something that is not a partition key. And that's where the scan comes in. The scan is an operation that's going to let you retrieve data on something that is not using the partition key. And then you can put a very flexible filtering criteria. So the beginning, yeah, real quick, we know that already. I'm going to import my SDK and any other libraries. I'm going to create that resource client, and then I'm going to get that reference to the trips table over here. Boom, I'm ready. So now I want to retrieve trips for a location. That's something that maybe my application wants to look, hey, for every user out there, let's take a look at all the trips that are for one specific location. Well, I don't have a key on location, right? My key is on the user ID. So I'm going to have to use a scan over here. Now, the thing about the scan, folks, you're going to go, oh, wow, that's great. It's very flexible. But in order to get that data for that flexible condition is going to have to walk through the whole table. So that's not going to be as efficient as a query, and frankly is going to cost more resources on AWS. But sometimes that's what you need, so let's do it over here. My criteria for my filter is going to be the location. It's going to do a location of Iceland. So let's see, maybe I have more than one user going to Iceland. Beautiful place. And now, again, the format of those calls tend to be very similar. I'm still going to do the scan, but here it's not a key or a key condition, it's a filter expression. You know, the filter expression now, it doesn't have to be an exact match. I can do something fancy like, well, my location field has to contain this particular location over here. Locations is the name of the attribute in my table. Location over here with the little colon is taking on this attribute that I'm passing over here, because that gets filled in right here on the expression attribute value. That's a common thing that a lot of database syntax does. They put the placeholder over here, and then now here on this expression attribute value, you kind of fill in, hey, what is that placeholder is going to get? Yeah, it's going to be the value of that variable. So when I do this, I should get the results for all the trips to that location. Again, the data, that's going to look exactly like the other ones did before. So that doesn't change the format of the output. And again, because I'm going to have more than one, potentially more than one piece of data returned for my scan, I will once again get that list that comes inside the items. So if I were to scroll up, take my word for it, I would have everything inside items. So just like I did in the query, I'm going to use regular Python to parse, to iterate through each item and then get the data out of the individual fields. And that's how I'm able to do this report and say, hey, both Lexi and Tucker, my cat and my dog, are going on a trip to Iceland. That was a scan, but I did say that I'm not getting super great performance. So is there a way that I can get really good performance and not have to use a scan? Well, let's take a look at that now with indexes. I'm going back to my table definition over here to create an index. Now, I'm actually not going to create that for the locations query because I'm only going to do that occasionally. So a scan is perfectly fine for that. But what I will be doing regularly in my application is that I'm going to have to differentiate upcoming trips from past trips. So to do that, I need to do a comparison on start date. And right now, start date is not my partition key or my sort key. So over here, I go to indexes. And I'm going to create an index. I'm going to use the same partition key actually because all of my queries are going to be for one user at the time of my application. But for the sort key, I'm going to use that start date. I don't want to give, it gives you a reasonable default name, but let me give it a name that I pick myself on that index. So it's going to be an index for trips by user ID and start date. And by the way, folks, this index in DynamoDB is like a mini table, so you will have to set up the capacity and everything. And also an important part of it is indexes can choose to include all of the attributes or only certain attributes. We call that projecting those attributes. So in this case, I'm going to choose that my index is going to have access to all the attributes. It's going to take more resources, but that's what I want. So I'm going to create the index now. It's in the process of creating right now, and as soon as it's done, I'm gonna go to perform a query on it. We're ready to do our query with the index now, and you're gonna see it's 90% the same thing as the query we did earlier. Now, certainly the stuff about the SDK is the same. I'm also gonna get the same resource client, and I'm even gonna get the same reference to the table, to the trips table over here using my resource client. Now, here's where it gets a little different, because I want to do a query for a range of dates. But the query is going to be against the index. That's one thing about DynamoDB. If you have an index, you're querying against that index. So the partition key and sort key that matter is the partition key and sort key for the index. So it's the user ID and the start date. So I set my data to be retrieved over here. So I'm going to do a query for the user ID Tucker and this range of dates over here. And then I'm going to do my operation. Now the operation looks very similar to the previous query, but I have this very important extra line over here because I'm specifying the index. I have to do the query against the index if I expect to use the sort key for the index. So for the partition key, I'm still gonna have to have an equality on my key condition expression. If you're doing a query, partition key has to be an equality. But when it gets to the sort key, yeah, I can get flexible and I can do an in-between over here and look for a range between my from date and my to date. So when I run this query, that should give me the results between that date. I can take a quick look at the full data. And yes, that's going to give me a lot of data again. I'm not even going to look at it again because we already know the format. We already know that the items are going to be inside the items field. And I'm just going to get the start date, end date, and locations. And there you go, it worked. If you were to compare the dates, you would see that yes, they match within that range. So that's my query with the index. The last thing we're gonna look at, it's an update. You can see over here in the current data that I have that Lexi over here has a trip schedule for Vermont, but she doesn't have a detailed itinerary. Well, you're gonna see that in my application, I have the ability to add an itinerary. So if I go over here, I will be able to update the itinerary for that existing record for Lexi. So the usual stuff in the beginning, I'm going to get the SDK and any other libraries that I need. Then I'm going to create the resource client again. And then I'm going to use the client to get a reference to that table, the trips table. Now I have trips table in my hand. And the update's going to be an update with the specific item, so I have to specify the partition key and the sort key of the item I'm trying to update. So I'm going to specify that I want Lexi, and this is a trip ID for that trip to Vermont. That's the data that I'm going to use. And then I have to provide the data that I'm updating with. I'm going to be adding an itinerary attribute to that trip. That's a detailed itinerary for a trip, 3-day trip to Vermont. So there's just data over here about different places and different things to do in Vermont. So let's set that data. And now that I have the key and the data that I'm gonna set, yes, I'm gonna use the key because an update is gonna be on a primary key using the update item. So it's gonna be an update item. I specify the primary key of the item I want to update. And then I do this update expression where I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to set the itinerary to this itinerary colon value over here, and we did another one like that before. This itinerary colon value over here is gonna get replaced with the itinerary variable that I have it over there that I just showed you in this expression attribute values. So when you have one of those colon type of variables over here, you need one of those expression attribute values clause to be able to specify what value you want to put in there. So I'm gonna run this, and my update should have worked. I can check the response, but in this case, it's just gonna be something that says that, yeah, it was a success, 200. Where I can really check that it got updated is I can go back to my database, I can redo the query, and you can see right now that Lexi does have an itinerary. I'm not gonna bother opening and showing the full itinerary, but it's all there. And that's the end of our practical DynamoDB journey. Don't forget, I'm gonna take all of the code that you saw in here, and for the next video in this series, I'm gonna put that in Lambda functions as we introduce the Lambda service. I'm also going to share all the code with you. Take a look at the description for where I'm sharing the code. And don't forget, if there's some of those concepts in DynamoDB that you weren't quite sure of, indexes, partition keys, look at that extra video that I also provided that kind of covers DynamoDB at a theoretical level. All right, thank you very much. See you later.